Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. I am Selim Kuru. I am an associate professor and chair of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department, and also the director of Persian and Iranian Studies program, which is hosted at our department. This event is the first in a series that we called Rising Scholars in Persian and Iranian Studies. And you can see, like here. And our first guest is Kevin Schwartz, whom my dear colleague Samed Alawi will introduce to you in a short while. I would like to thank our administrator, Patrick Gibbs, whom you met at the door, for helping us organize this event. And I would also like to tell you a bit about upcoming events, especially one event that is made up of 3 parts in May. You might have read about it already, but this is a really important signature event for our department as well, which focuses on Iranian Revolution of 1979 from different perspectives, with the attendance of 8 guests from various universities from the US and abroad. And the event will be May 12th and May 13th. It will start with a keynote speech on Friday night, and then there will be a workshop on Saturday, which will culminate in a concert that features one of the greatest composers of Iran, Ali Sametpour, and his ensemble. It's called Hemsaz. And the concert will be in Town Hall, so we are also working for it. But tonight, we have a very distinguished scholar of Iranian literature and literary history, and I would like to invite Dr. Samed Alawi, our department's professor of Persian and Iranian Studies. Samed's work is on Iranian modern poetry before and after the revolution, and he teaches various classes here. This quarter he is teaching a very popular class, obviously, writing Iranian Revolution, and I can see that some of the people here are taking that class. Like, very good. Samed?
Thank you, Dr. Kuru. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I hope the extra credit pays off. For those of you who are here for the extra credit, I know that intellectually it will pay off for all of you. We have a really exciting talk, and it's my honor to introduce our speaker for tonight. It's a rare pleasure to introduce a speaker who you respect as much as a scholar as you value him as a friend, and that is my distinct honor tonight. Dr. Kevin Schwartz joins us from the U.S. Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., where he currently conducts his research as a Kluge postdoctoral fellow. And I want to give you just a bit of context about Dr. Schwartz's work and the significance of his work and the accolades that it has received. In very recent years, as some of you know quite well, scholars in Persian and Iranian studies have turned their attention to the period roughly between, let's say, the 16th and the 19th centuries CE, when the Persian language transitioned from what we would think of as an international language or a lingua franca to and a language that was produced across a wide swath of Western, Central, and South Asia, to the 20th century, when the Persian language became, by and large, a language associated with particular nation states, Iran, of course, being the largest among them, and therefore the one that receives the most attention. Now, the consequences of such a historical transformation can hardly be overstated. If we think of Persian language and literature today as a phenomenon that pertains only to the country of Iran, then we end up overlooking, or worse, as has been the case with many literary studies, looking down upon the rich and diverse examples of Persian literary and cultural production in the Indian subcontinent, in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and so on. But that trend is reversing, thanks in large part to many of the people in this room. One can think of, for example, Shahab Ahmad's monumental What is Islam?, which came out in 2016, which argues that, quote, Persian poetry was construed by the educated Muslim elite of the Balkans to Bengal complex as a universal language of meaning-making belonging fully, integrally, and enfranchisedly to the Persian Persian reading Muslims of the Balkans to Bengal complex as a whole. So Shahab Ahmad's work has done really very much to I think, convince us that Persian played a central role in an Islamic civilization that covered a much larger area than we think of as the Persian-speaking world today. In the Persian language, one thinks of an Iranian scholar like Mohammad Reza Shafi'i Kadkani, whose attention to the poet Bidel and to the so-called Indian school of poetry in recent decades has also received much attention. Now, Dr. Kevin Schwartz's scholarship has been at the forefront of this trend towards revisiting pre- and early modern Persian literature as a transnational phenomenon. His doctoral dissertation at UC Berkeley investigated sites of literary production and discursive transformation in Iran, India, and Afghanistan. The dissertation won the prestigious Rahim M. Irvani Award for exceptional scholarship on Persian literature and its cognate fields in 2016. His scholarly work has also been published in the Journal of Persianate Studies and the Indian Economic and Social History Review. And this September, Dr. Schwartz will begin a new position as Iran Research Fellow at the Oriental Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences. And while it saddens me to see the U.S. lose one of our finest cultural historians of the early modern Persian, I have no doubt that Dr. Schwartz will continue to publish cutting-edge research in his new position in Prague. You're here now. You just made it in time for the very formal part of the introduction. Dr. Kevin Schwartz holds degrees in political science from Columbia University, Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard, and Near Eastern Studies from the University of California at Berkeley, where he received his PhD in 2014. He has held teaching and research positions at the U.S. Naval Academy, the University of Maryland, and most recently the U.S. Library of Congress. And in addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Schwartz has published commentary and analysis on contemporary foreign affairs in such venues as the Baltimore Sun, Al Jazeera America, Asia Times, and Counterpunch, among others. And again, I must say, it is truly a pleasure and honor to welcome Kevin Schwartz here tonight. So, Kevin, welcome.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much, Sama, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Department of Near Eastern Language and Civilizations. Thank you to Salim. And thank you all for being here tonight. What I want to do in my talk, The Return of the Masters, Connections, Contestations, and the Redrawing of Persian Literary History, is really to present one basic idea that hopefully I can do well enough to convince you of by the end of the talk. And that basic idea is the following: that Persian literary history, as it's come to be written, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, is insufficient. And the reason it's insufficient is because it's been unable to account for a multiplicity of literary phenomena or literary voices occurring outside of Iran's borders, particularly in Central and South Asia. Or to put it more bluntly, Persian literary history of this time in the 18th and 19th century has become synonymous with Iranian literary history. The two have been conflated. In fact, I think you can pinpoint the exact idea and concept by which the writing of Persian literary history was interjected with this Iranian nationalist sentimentality. And this is an idea I'll develop and come back to throughout my talk, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of it right now. And that's the idea of bazgashta adabi, or literary return. And it states in brief that Iranian poets, and this is key, only Iranian poets, in the 18th and 19th century rescued Persian poetry from degradation and stagnation and despair by returning to the simple and classical styles of the masters, those canonical figures like Sa'di, Rumi, Hafez, and Ferdowsi. Now, this idea has had very important impacts and left a lot of historiographical debris in its wake. Well, for one thing I mentioned, it's the conflation of Iranian and Persian literary history. In other words, the sole focus, exclusive focus on Iranian poets of this time has become synonymous or has been in the place of writing the history of the totality of the Persian sphere that extended far beyond Iran's borders. Secondly, this idea of bazgashta adabi has led to a greater proprietary right over the great canonical masters, people again like Anvari, Ferdowsi, and Sa'di, by saying that only these poets in Iran returned and engaged with the work of these classical figures, whereas other poets in Central Asia and South Asia did not, but remained mired in this stagnating style called the Indian style that we'll see in a minute. And because of this exclusive focus, there's been an erasure of other facets of Persian literary culture outside of Iran. So there's been an inattention or marginalization to literary phenomena occurring in Central Asia and South Asia during this time. Now, just one brief caveat before I go any further. None of this research is meant to marginalize or minimize the contributions of Iran to Persian literary history, either during the 18th and 19th century or in general. But as Sama noted in his introduction, the idea is to reintegrate a multiplicity of voices outside of Iran's borders and to create a more integrative and inclusive Persian literary history and recover aspects of Persian, of this prevalent and important global lingua franca. So I've broken my presentation into 3 parts. First, I'll look at the narrative of return. So what is this narrative about? Where did this concept arise from? Who developed it? What are some of its characteristics? Secondly, I'll look at the return poets of Iran, those poets from 18th and 19th century Esfahan and Tehran, who did in fact seek to return to the styles of the masters. But as we'll see, the reason in which they decided to return to the styles of the masters is much different than what we've been told. And finally, in the third part, I'll point to a couple other movements outside of Iran. One, a small court in South India, that of the last Nawab of Arcot, and another I'll look at the Jangnamer battle poem literature stemming from the first Anglo-Afghan war in the mid-19th century. Again, with the idea to create a more inclusive and integrative Persian literary history. So to begin the narrative return, where did this concept come from? Well, the standard narrative in Persian literary history is largely the work of this man you can see here, Muhammad Taqi Bahar, the great poet, intellectual, and author, who divided the development of Persian literary history into 4 schools or periods or styles. And he talked about this in his famous work, Sabshkinasi, Stylistics. And these 4 schools or styles are listed there. Each one has a name: Khorasani, Iraqi, Indian style literary return. Each one is affiliated with a different temporal period: Khorasani, the 19th to 13th century, Iraqi, 13th to 15th, and so on. And finally, he gave each one of these styles a set of core characteristics. So the Khorasani style, for example, was most prevalent in the form of the qasideh, the ode. It was performed at the court setting where someone, a poet, received patronage and was bestowing grandeur and beneficence on this patron, talking about the hunt and merrymaking and winemaking and the great deeds of war. The Iraqi style, by contrast, which more or less corresponds, you can see, the beginning of the Mongol invasion and the destruction it wreaked on Islamic societies, was more introspective, was more mystically inclined. This is the poetry of Rumi and Hafez and others. Finally, the Indian style was one that was very self-referential. It was one that was very manneristic. It was interested in linguistic acrobatics, complicated metaphors. It was defined by literateurs and intellectuals, always trying to one-up one another, with coming up with more complicated imagery and referring back either to a verse of a contemporary poet or even someone further back in time. And finally, as I mentioned, this literary return of the 18th and 19th century, where poets in Iran, and only in Iran, sought to return to the styles of the Khorasani and Iraqi school, those classical masters of some time ago. Now, what's interesting about this schematic, and what really engaged me with the topic to begin with, is that the first three schools, they refer to Persian poetic styles and Persian literary production that is related to the totality of the Persianate world, not only in Iran, but also in Central and South Asia as well. When we get to the fourth school, the literary return, it is only exclusive to Iran. So you see in Bahar's schematic this kind of winnowing down of Persian literary history, which reaches its apex with Iranian literary history. So of course, this begs the question, if these return poets of the 18th and 19th century in Iran were returning to the simplistic styles, or the simple styles of the classical masters, what were they returning from? And this, Bahar and others who rely on his schematic are very clear. They're returning from the so-called Indian style, this overly complicated style that we're told was responsible for the decline and stagnation of Persian poetry. One that was obscurantist, it was grammatically incorrect, abstruse, complicated. And crucially, this style was prevalent and associated with all places outside of Iran, Central and South Asia. So already you can see some kind of dichotomy being formed here. Bazgasht on the one hand and the Indian style on the other. A simple, understandable poetry and a more complicated style on the other. Or you could see, for example, an Iranian self focusing on the exclusivity of Iranian poets and its ability to rescue Persian poetry, and an Indian other. And lest you think I'm just singling out or criticizing Bahar, this idea, this criticism of the Indian style, that basically the entirety of Persian literary production in the 18th and 19th century outside of Iran was mired in stagnation, is one that until only fairly recently has been sufficiently challenged. Up until that point, about 10, 15 years ago, Western and Iranian scholars have been heavily influenced by this conception of the Indian style that Bahar developed. And there you can see a stanza translated by the great Ehsan Yashater. The Indian style possessed novelty but had very many failings. It was infirm and spineless. Its ideas were feeble, its imagery odd. The poems were crowded with ideas but unattractive. They were wanting in eloquence. And this is a pretty typical impression of this type of style. But what's interesting is that you could go back previous to Bahar. You can go back to the pre-modern period. You could go back to pre-modern prose texts, and you can find traces of this dichotomy developing. You could find traces in these works of Tazkirehs where people began to discuss and conceptualize the return movement and began to juxtapose a simple versus a complicated style. And just a little brief interlude for those not familiar, the Tazkireh is a genre of text. It comes from the Arabic root dhakara, to recall or remember. And it's really a biographical anthology. So it's a collection of maybe as little as 10, as many as 3,000 entries on various poets in my case. It has their birth date, their death date, who they studied with, facts of their life, and of course it has their poetry as well. It's really a who's who of various individuals. And this is a genre that was prevalent throughout Islamic history, appearing in different languages, whether Urdu or Turkish or Arabic, and in different formats, focusing on Sufis or scholars as well. So one can go back to some of these works, these pre-modern works, and you can find traces of this dichotomy between a simple style and a complicated style, one that Bahar would heavily rely upon. And here we'll look at a selection from the 6-volume Tazkireh from the Qajar period, the most famous and comprehensive Tazkireh, this biographical dictionary anthology, by Reza Quli Khan Hedayat. There you see a picture of him there, the great statesman, traveler, diplomat of the court of Nasruddin Shah. And he writes in the introduction, the 6-volume work, now with a little distance in the 19th century, versifiers became inclined toward the outlining of riddles and the conjuring up of misnomers. They established the style of confused speech, idle prattle, and vain oratory, after a manner of sickly dispositions and indirect style. So that's going to be the Indian style that Bahar codifies in his schematic. And you can obviously hear an echo of Bahar in those statements. But Hedayat continues, several people settled on the restoration of old masters' method. They became aware of the tastelessness of the modern style and their contemptible fashion. So that's the Bazgasht Adabi. That's what Bahar will call Bazgasht Adabi, this return movement where Iranian poets rescued Persian poetry from despair. But I would argue, until very recently, Tazkirehs as a genre have been marginalized. And in fact, they haven't been looked at very critically. So someone like Bahar might take this one Tazkireh at face value and being representative of all the other voices that had occurred previously. But if you go even further back in time, and you look at other prose sources, and you look at the poetry of these poets themselves, you actually have another narrative emerge about why these poets sought to return to the styles of the great classical masters. And that's what I will turn to right now, the return poets of Iran, because as I mentioned, there were in fact a group of poets who sought to return Persian poetry to the simple, grandiose styles of the poets of yore. So who were these Bazgasht poets? Who were the poets of 18th and 19th century Esfahan? Was it really that these poets were keeping tabs on a bad, degraded style percolating in South Asia and Central Asia? Was it really an aesthetic movement to rescue Persian poetry? I would say no. I don't think I'd have much of a talk if I said yes. In fact, these poets in Esfahan, based on evidence in prose sources and their own poetry, were more concerned with their own local social and political conditions. They were more concerned in revitalizing and restoring the role of the poet in Esfahan, their own hometown. And why is this important? Why is it important, based on evidence, to say that these poets were more interested in responding to social dislocations, or more interested in their political conditions? Because we recognize that these poets, this movement, was more inward-looking, was more introspective. We begin to remove this kind of nationalist sheen that has shrouded Persian literary history. We begin to remove some of these geo-ethnic fault lines that course through Persian literary history, that pit an Iranian self against an Indian other, that pit an Iranian simple style of poetry against an Indian complicated style of poetry. So to understand the dislocations these poets face, we first have to understand what Persian poetry and poetic production was like during Safavid times. Of course, the Safavids ruled from 1500 to 1722, and they're known most prominently for converting Iran to Shi'ism. Now, there's a myth that they did not promote poetry based on the religious ideology and propaganda, but that is simply a myth. While they didn't have as many opportunities for patronage as their neighbors to the east, the Mughals, the Safavid court did in fact provide an avenue of poetic production for various poets to receive patronage. But more important than that, the real pulse of poetic culture in Esfahan and other places in Safavid times was in the coffee house. In the coffee house, poets could come, they could recite their verse, they could listen to verse, they could have their verse corrected, meet with students, have intellectual conversations. With the sacking of Esfahan in 1722 by the Afghan invaders, both of these avenues of poetic production were eradicated. The Safavids no longer existed, and Esfahan was destroyed. And just to bring the point home, this is Michael Axworthy discussing the impact of the Afghan invasion in 1722 on Esfahan, and he writes, "By mid-century, most of the built-up area of Esfahan, the former capital, was deserted, inhabited only by owls and wild animals. In the last years of the Safavids, it had been a thriving city of 550,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world, a similar size to London at the time or bigger. By the end of the siege of 1722, only 100,000 people were left, and although many citizens returned thereafter, the number fell yet again during the Afghan occupation, and later so that by 1736, there were only 50,000 people left." So from 550,000 people in a couple decades to 50,000 people. So it was a disastrous situation indeed. In this attitude of the disastrous situation in Esfahan and its particular impact on Persian poetry and the ability of one to produce Persian poetry, have opportunities to produce Persian poetry, is borne out in the evidence in anthologies, Tazkirehs, and also in the poetry of these founders of the Bazgasht movement. And one recognizes in reading these sources that first and foremost, they're not concerned with responding to an aesthetic style in India, a complicated Indian style, but first and foremost, they're more concerned with the social conditions and its impact on poetic culture. So here Azar says in his famous Atesh Kadeh, Tazkira itself, for many years, on account of the revolution of the time, at once the customs of poetic compositions are nullified, and the poets from great anguish are changed, and the resolve of poets is corrupted. The scattering of easy circumstances and the state of confusion are such that no one's in the state of reading poetry or composing poetry. Likewise, this attitude is further confirmed in the poetry of some of these poets, like Azar's companion Sabahi, who says, "Don't you see how the sacred Huma on this land and country is worth less than the owl of misfortune? There is no buyer of gems in this domain. The seller, the poet, makes no profit from selling the goods," his poetry. So what were these poets to do? I think they did something quite creative that admits this social and political dislocation and the impact of poetic culture. They sought to praise one another. They sought to reconstitute the role of the poet in society. But with no patron available to praise, they praised one another instead. They solidified their networks. And what was the model they relied upon to praise one another? Well, they reached back in their literary cultural memories, and they found the model most apt for the task. And that was the qasideh, the ode form of the Khorasani poets, the classical masters like Anvari, Rudaki, and others. In going back to their poetry, one finds profound examples of this. Poets would exchange and recite poems for one another, praising each other as the master of the age, not only with direct reference to the masters themselves, but did so in some cases through direct imitation of their poems. So here we have an exchanging of qasidehs between, again, Sabahi and Azar, written in the same meter and rhyme scheme as that of a poem by Anvari. And you can see in the initial poem and its response the repetition of image and the repetition of praise, and even the reference in the second stanza by Azar to Anvari. So Sabahi says, "O you before whom the teacher of knowledge kneels in deference to learning, before you the knot of the Pleiades undid its neat arrangement. Before your grandeur the Red Sea spilled its abundant water. The sun, which is the source of life, performs ablutions with the dust at your door." And then responding now to his poetic patron, Azar says in kind, "Your poetry is the knob of the Pleiades. Your prose is the river stealing the Red Sea." It appears that Anvari wrote this qasideh, but I see him planting barley while yours is like grain. Exclamation point. In your company, poetry from others means no more than dry ablution by the banks of the Tigris. So this return was an example of a group of poets seeking to combat a particularly problematic and stagnant style of poetry, increasingly to be associated with poets outside of Iran, but instead a group of poets responding to social and political dislocations on a local level in Esfahan, and trying to rectify the role of the poet in poetry in general. And to do so, they offered one another patronage, and did so by reaching back into their literary cultural memories and drawing the model most apt for the task, the great Khorasani poets, the ode writers of old, who were adept at praise poems. And again, this is important because it removes these geo-ethnic fault lines that have caused unnecessary erasures and are coursing through Persian literary history. Now, while these poets in Esfahan were reestablishing themselves in the role of the poet in Iran by imitating the masters of yore, across the Persianate sphere in South India around the same time, another community of poets was equally trying to find their footing upon the shifting terrain of Persian literary culture in the 18th and 19th century. And remarkably, they too, amidst the particular dislocations of their locale, began to take up similar issues regarding the practice of poetry. And so now we're going to turn to South Asia, and in particular a small court, that of the court of the last Nawab of Arcot. But before we do that, it's important to understand the position of Persian in the 19th century and the various dislocations and pressures it was facing. Now, of course, Persian was a critical and important administrative and literary language in the medieval and early modern period, culminating with that of the Mughals. But with the breakup of the Mughal Empire, Persian felt itself under pressure. And I've listed kind of three reasons in the 18th and 19th century why Persian was under pressure. Well, first, we had the break of the Mughal Empire. So even though that created new outlets for people who were versed in Persian writing technologies, whether they were administrators, tax collectors, judges, or poets, there was no longer that one concrete epicenter to which they could receive patronage. So we'll see people did go to various emergent courts, but it was a rearticulation of sorts. It was the beginning of the long delay of decline of Persian on the subcontinent. The second pressure upon Persian during this time was the British intervention in educational activities. So the British set up these colleges, both in South Asia and in the UK, where they trained East India Company civil servants in various local and Islamic languages, Persian being one of them. But what you see in the 19th century is that while they still hired Persian instructors and teachers, Urdu now is more than keeping pace. There were more courses being offered than Urdu, and in other Indian vernacular languages, there were more works being translated into Urdu. So again, Persian was being pushed aside. And this is perhaps typified by Thomas Macaulay's 1835 famous Minute on Education, which I'm sure many of you know. A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. And by Arabia, he means the birthplace, the homeland of Islam, and the languages associated with it, primarily Arabic and Persian. And finally, what led to the dislocation of Persian and the pressure upon Persian in the 19th century was the slow rise of Rekhta, which was slowly coming to call itself Urdu. In these new dynastic courts that are emerging in the breakup of the Mughal Empire, there were now increased opportunities for poets to receive patronage in Urdu. On a societal level, one sees the increased acceptability of Urdu to serve as a literary and cultural medium of expression and inform of poetic societies, and the increasing importance and emergence of Urdu literary and educational networks. Now, this is not to say that Persian evaporated or disappeared in one fell swoop, but it was to say there were various dislocations and pressures put upon it in the 19th century. So it's even more curious that you have this court emerging with the breakup of the Mughals in the 19th century that becomes an outpost of vibrant Persian poetic culture and literary activity. And this is the court of the last Nawab of Arcot, who was the last ruler of the Carnatic state. And just to get our geographical bearings, there's Arcot next to present-day Chennai, which was once Madras, one of the seats of British power in India. So why was Persian so important to this Nawab? Why was it still a vibrant bastion of Persian literary activity? Well, I'll give you three reasons. First, after 1801, the state was under the suzerainty of the British. So that meant the British now controlled the political, military, and foreign affairs of this state. And what that meant is that this shored up opportunities and potential for the Nawab and his predecessors to focus on cultural activity. And that they did. They focused on non-political matters. They founded libraries that collected works in Islamic literatures like Urdu, Arabic, and Persian. They founded schools. They continued to teach the Islamic sciences alongside the British, who were starting their own high schools at the time. Secondly, this was an outpost of vibrant Persian literary activity because the court was located next to Madras, one of the seats of British power. Now, as I noted, the British were slowly moving away from Persian, but they still relied on it to interface with various local elites and dynastic rulers like the Nawab. So you had people, administrators, tax collectors, judges, etc., who would come down from North India and would work for either the Nawab or more likely for the British. They might serve as a secretary, a travel companion, a tutor, what have you. They would do that during the day as their profession, but at night they would engage in poetry. They'd write a book on Irfan or a work of prosody. Finally, in addition to the politics and the geography, Persian flourished here because of the personality of the Nawab himself. So he composed Persian Urdu poetry from an early age under the pen name Azam, being the grandest, and he established a poetic society solely devoted to Persian poetry, begun in 1846, that lasted until 1855. Even though he and other members of his court composed poetry in Urdu, this poetic society was solely devoted to the production, recitation, and correction of Persian. But most important, which is so curious about this state, is the outpouring of tazkires. And here I just have a list, I don't have the translation, but just in Persian, of all the tazkires being produced during this time around the Nawab's court. And except for the tazkires being produced in Tehran at the time, at the court of the Qajars, this has the most expansive production of tazkires. And what's so fascinating about this is that tazkires are clues into understanding the literary, social, and intellectual life of various communities. So they've been marginalized for some time, but if you begin to look at them more closely, really interesting, fascinating elements of these literary communities emerge. And even more important for these tazkires being produced here, they were all produced in response to one another, which is a very unique aspect. So someone would write a tazkireh, they list all the individuals they thought was important, they'd give their criticism of literary theory and Persian poetry, and then about a year later, someone else wrote a different one. And they'd remember the poets they wanted to remember, and they'd give their own criticism of Persian poetry, and respond to things that were said in the previously written tazkireh. And this goes on throughout the Nawab's court. And if you begin to look at these tazkirehs and these texts in comparison to one another, you can start to tease out important literary debates. You can begin to understand what it is that's important to these poets. One thing you can even do, you can even reconstruct their educational and instructional networks. So this I pulled from one tazkireh, Isharat Binesh, that was produced with the express purpose to list or remember all the people in the Nawab's poetic society. And he gave great attention to who studied with who. And so I decided to map this and to understand who studied with who corrected the verse of who. And what begins to emerge is that there were rivalries. So you could see these poets with the bigger, darker circles were the most connected teachers, the most important poets. And those with smaller circles on the margins were the most disconnected. And what emerges is this rivalry between one poet, Aga, and those associated with them, and then way up in the top upper right corner, Vasef. Now, I'm not going to get into all the twists and turns of this debate. When you clear away all the rivalries, all the back and forth about who breached decorum and who didn't, what becomes clear is that when one gets to the apogee of this debate, it concerns who has the right to speak for Persian poetry. And the debate reaches its climax in discussion of the poet Abdülkadir Bidel, who both at the time and today is considered the epitome of the bad, complicated Indian style. And the debate was over whether his poetry could be accepted as a complicated style within the Persian canon, or whether it was better to have a more simple style of poetry, more in line with the classical masters. So you can see the same dividing line that Bahar has in his schematic is present here in India. In many ways, they anticipated, maybe 70 years previously, this dividing line that Bahar would draw upon. But crucially here, we're not talking about Iranians on one side of the debate and Indians on the other. We're talking about an intra-Indian debate. So even if we work within the categories based on Bahar's nationalistic narrative of Persian history, there are non-Iranian voices who have a story to tell, who around the same time that Persian is being nationalized in Iran are themselves dealing with the same vexing issues as the status quo of Persian literary culture is shifting underfoot. Now finally, I'll just turn to Afghanistan, another locale of poetic production that is often forgotten. And this focuses on poetry produced in the aftermath of the Anglo-Afghan War. So not unlike their South Asian and Iranian contemporaries, the Afghans of this time faced their own social and political dislocations. And that was the invasion of the British that occupied their country from 1839 to 1842, and the ousting of their ruler, Dost Muhammad Khan, which ended in the British being pushed out and an Afghan nationalist victory. Now, depictions of this war exist in a vast amount of historical works. In English and other languages, it appears in works, diaries, and journals, also in paintings, related to the invasion, occupation, and eventual retreat of the British. But they also exist in indigenous sources. They also exist in battle poems that are writing the events of this time in the same style and manner as Ferdowsi's Book of Kings. Ferdowsi, of course, being one of those undisputed masters whom poets in Iran, and only poets in Iran, we're told, were interested. And these poems depict the desperate situation of the Afghans and the British, the glory of resistance led by Dost Muhammad Khan's son Akbar, who is a major nationalist hero. And there we can see him just right here. And incidentally, if you look at the poetry of the Taliban, they also reference Akbar as this great nationalist hero. And so you had these works that are being produced. Another one was the Jangnameh of Ghulami, and like the Akbarnameh, they were reissued in the 1950s by the Afghan Historical Society. So you could see that obviously it was a great moment of national pride and national resistance based on a battle poem of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. So what's important about these texts? Well, I think it's twofold. First, I'm unaware of Persian literary history of this many imitations of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh occurring around one particular singular historical event of import. Now, you can find people who recite the Shahnameh in the Ottoman court, in the Qajar court, who will talk about the deeds of their patron. You could find a couple Shahnamehs or Shahnameh imitations related to the battle between the Safavids and the Portuguese. But those all pale in comparison to the text being produced here. Not only the Jangnameh and Akbarnameh, but also the Zafarnameh of Kabul, also, that was imitative of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. But more important for my purposes is that the production of these texts extend from Kashmir to Kabul to South India. These texts were based on oral tales collected from passerby and travelers who witnessed key events, circulating in manuscript form, and were printed in places like Lucknow and Agra. And they benefited from the patronage of both local rulers and even the British themselves. The British even commissioned a Persian battle poem in imitation of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh for propaganda. So that should just give you an idea of how important they saw as this genre and how prevalent it was in circulating. In other words, these texts, again, drawing on the style and form of one of the great masters, create a type of market that privileged and valued this style, which in and of itself would be interesting enough, but even more so in the story of Persian literary history has specifically edited out an occurrence such as this. Let me just conclude with a couple thoughts here. What I've hoped to demonstrate is that the prevailing paradigm of Bazgasht as an exclusively Iranian phenomenon, which is meant to define all features of Persian literary culture in the 18th and 19th century, is lacking. One can point, as I hope I have, not only to examples of rearticulations and expressions of a vibrant Persian literary culture outside of Iran during this time, such as in South India and Afghanistan, but the similar matters in which non-Iranian communities, like their Iranian counterparts, were engaging in debates, expressions with the Persian canon of the masters, and trying to find their place among them, or in relation to them, in an ever-shifting Persianate world and the face of various dislocations, whether social, political, linguistic, or otherwise, and beyond the specific paradigm of how poets or poetic communities engage with the masters. I really think there's much work to be done. There's much work to be done in understanding Persian as a global lingua franca during this time, and how it created connections or contestations amongst various communities throughout the globe. And I think one way to do that is, of course, not privileging what's happening solely in Iran, but expanding our geographic focus, but also looking at other sources and using other methodologies. And as you may have gathered from this presentation, I have a soft spot for tazkiras, because for me, tazkiras are really the building blocks of what's happening socially, intellectually, and of course, from a literary perspective at the time. And so what I've begun to do in my work is map the production of these tazkiras with the hopes that I could start figuring out how people saw themselves, either locally or trans-regionally, in this world of the Persianate sphere that was crumbling in the 18th and 19th century. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks. That was a really thought-provoking talk. A lot to think about with questions of nationalism, patronage, who writes poetry, who reads poetry, identity, memory. There's a lot of ways we could take this. So, and we have time for questions. So, I'll start here with Purna.
Glad you ended with this style.
Yeah.
Because it kind of coalesces into the question I'm going to ask. You know, a lot of scholars, including you, have noticed how the tazkiras always seem to pop up. Right? And the other pre-contestera production, of course, is the 18th century. Corner of this.
Yeah.
I am wondering if you could walk your argument back and look at the debates about localization of Persian itself that began happening in the 18th century and prominent in scholarly debates, and I'm thinking here of for Alam. How do you think your story all throughout the Persian court about whether Persian is emerging as a kind of cosmopolitan languages versus the kind of elements that particular emphasize in the way they are approaching the subject? To what extent do you think this feeds into later on?
Yeah, no, it's a very thought-provoking question. I'll go forward on the slide here. Just so you could see, I mean, Tazkir production at 1600, there's not that many. Tazkir production at 1900, there's quite a few more, and I actually have a time-lapse video that shows you as it's produced, but I don't have it here. What you could see happening is, sure, there's still a center of production in North India around Delhi and Agra and Lucknow. But with the breakup of the Mughals, there certainly is a trickling of Tazkir production elsewhere. To Hyderabad, Karnataka, even you find a couple in Mumbai and Calcutta. And I think, and I haven't looked at all these Tazkiras in detail, but what I think is interesting is that one would believe that there might be more localization on account of this, on account of the kind of cropping up of new, smaller courts. But I'm kind of believing that it might be the opposite, that with the loss of this epicenter, that you now have people who are trying to not only talk about their own local poets, but also make sure they record back that which was lost. And, you know, it's a different phenomenon than you see in Iran. And so the Indian Tazkir writers of the 19th century, I think they're much more attentive to Persian as a global language from what I'm seeing. They're much more attentive to what's not happening only in South Asia, but what's happening in Iran as well. But in Iran, that's not the case. That with the total destruction of the Safavids, they're basically starting from scratch, and they more or less are starting in one place, and that is in Qajar Tehran. And all the Tazkiras produced in Qajar Tehran are more or less Iranian-centric. You even find Tazkiras being produced in different locales in Iran, in places like Yazd and Esfahan and Kashan, but even those were produced for a Qajar prince or noble. So they were very, very much ideologically invested in that project of patronage. So that's kind of the way I've thought about it, maybe with space and distance, maybe not so much around kind of vernacularization. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just kind of paying attention to how kind of expansive and pervasive Persian literary culture was and the Persian language was outside of Iran, even as late as the 19th century, and even going into the 20th century. And I think, you know, even in the 20th century, we're just so trained to think in nationalist terms. But, you know, there are poets in what becomes Tajikistan, there are poets in Afghanistan, there are poets in Iran like Bahar who are undertaking similar approaches to poetry, that is maintaining new models and or kind of interjecting it with ideas about modernity, ideas about education, constitutional rights, etc. And that's a kind of global phenomena, I think, that's happening in Persian poetry at the time. But we're so conditioned to think about only what's happening in Iran, or less so only what's happening in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, that we don't think to integrate them. So I think really what I try to do, and a lot of people are doing, like Purnima and others, is just recovering this great history, this rich transnational history of Persian, which I think is really, really important, that helped connect people. And yeah, there were differences, of course. There were debates across boundaries or even within communities. But I mean, this was a lingua franca that connected elites, scholars, Sufis, and others. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a bunch of ways. It's a great question. There's a bunch of ways to answer it. First, from the kind of textual standpoint, again, I'll go back to this map I didn't show. I mean, one thing I tried to do was just look at all the sources or citations various Tazkira authors referenced in their works. And this is, I guess, a network map of 18th century South Asian Tazkiras, and the larger circles are those most prominently cited Tazkiras. And the one at the bottom, Tazkira Nasrabadi, was produced in late Safavid Esfahan. And so people in South Asia were heavily aware of that and relying on that, which I think is quite interesting and indicative of people being aware of one another. The issue of Iran being the center is an interesting one. So obviously for Bahar it certainly is. And I think, for a long time, and I do this as well, we want to kind of push back against that. But if you read the sources really closely, especially in the 19th century, it was certainly a point of insecurity for South Asians. And I haven't figured out exactly when it was. I think we've read back, certainly in the 18th century and previously, some of these kind of proto-nationalist divisions. There's a famous debate between Arzu and Hazin, and people have made it about an Iranian, Hazin, who comes to India, and Arzu being about their ethnic identities. It's really about stylistics. But something happens in the 19th century, and you feel as though that the South Asian poets are really feeling marginalized. And even when they talk about Bidel, who was born in Patna, South Asian, some of them say, if Bidel was born in Esfahan, you wouldn't be giving him this much trouble. You would raise him to the 9th climb, but he's not born in Esfahan. So therefore, and he's a Sunni that I actually mentioned too, and so you're degrading him. So there was a kind of awareness, and I think one has to be careful because you don't want to read that back throughout the entirety of Persian literary history, but you also want to be kind of cognizant of this as well, that it does develop at some point. Yeah, certainly. I mean, for inter-imperial communication, Persian was going to be the lingua franca being used. I certainly don't talk much about Persian literary culture in Ottoman lands, which begin to be phased out by Ottoman literature. But I'm not going to answer anything about Ottoman literature. I'll just defer to Salim, who's sitting here. But you're absolutely right. That's something that we talked about prior to the talk. I really would like to incorporate more of Ottoman Turkey in Ottoman lands in in this study, and the kind of afterlife of Persian is shorter than it is in South Asia, but I think it is definitely an important part of this tale, without a doubt.
Question was related with this diets version 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
The reactions
Mm-hmm.
but also like this Persian that qualities,
Mm.
etc. There's an Balkans and the
Yeah.
Ottomans. My knowledge in Anatolia and other reaction to
Mm-hmm.
was there such a thing in India as well, this strong reaction?
I mean, in India or in
Corrupting
Iran?
effect.
Oh, you mean it was do the Iranians think it was corrupting, or was it the other way around?
I'm
Sorry.
thinking about like South Asia, Afghanistan.
Did they think that Persian was corrupting then?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I don't think so. I mean, the kind of obvious, if we're looking at literature, the obvious group you go to in Central Asia is the Jadids, and they use Persian. I mean, that was the global language, even though a lot of them spoke a kind of, Turkic language. I mean, you have Muhammad Iqbal as another example, who kind of as a latecomer uses Persian, thinking he's going to reach this global, expansive audience, and no one's really listening. And the same thing, there was another example I have, but I don't remember who it was. Oh, you have Mahmoud Tarzi in Afghanistan, who also, I mean, at the same time that Pashto was being raised as this important nationalist language, he was still writing poetry in Persian. So I mean, for him, I think it's certainly, or for the Jadids, it's certainly meshed, or they didn't kind of butt heads. But that's definitely something to think about, that they were kind of maybe projecting outward and talking about, Persian as a global language, but they were using or promoting more local languages on a national level. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know how much I can comment upon the interaction of Persian and Urdu beyond what I said about Tarzi. But so there are two interesting elements of Bazgasht, as you know, in Afghanistan. I mean, one, I think, is kind of creeping up organically on from a societal level. But there was also at the court of Abdurrahman Khan this idea that, well, there were poets at his court who were interested and very self-conscious in imitating Rumi and Hafez. And in fact, the person who was the forefront of this was Mahmoud Tarzi's father, Ghulam Muhammad Tarzi. And so Afghan scholars have kind of read back in time that there was, in fact, a group of poets at the courts of the Afghan rulers in the late 19th, early 20th century who were self-consciously doing the same thing. I don't know if I agree with it somewhat. I mean, it might have just been happening on a small scale inside that court, but there's definitely a group of Afghan literary scholars who are using this to kind of bolster their own Persian nationalist credentials, who clearly recognize what Bahar has done. And I talk about this in my dissertation because I think it's important to integrate those voices, even if they're incorrect, but just to say, like, we need to talk about these Afghan scholars who, much prior to me, were kind of calling out Bahar. Now, you could argue that they were doing it by making up a story about their own Bazgash, but I think that has a lot of value to point to their criticism, that they were well aware of this kind of nationalist project. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that, it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier. I mean, people always talk about the Qajars that ruled, from 1800 to 1925. I mean, really with kind of one foot in traditional Iranian society and one foot in modern Iranian society, they had problems with creating a modern state and various challenges. But one thing they were very, very aware of was the power of poetry to create this kind of ideological project. And no one, I mean, there's one colleague we have, Dominic Brookshaw, who's begun to look at the Qajars and their poetic production. But again, they've kind of been marginalized. And no one's really looked at the way in which it may intersect with some kind of political, ideological project. I should mention kind of one little footnote, is there's a real irony about Bazgasht, because on the one hand, it's used as this concept to recenter Iran, to return the center of Persian poetry in Iran from India, because, I mean, the anecdote is that in, I don't know, the 17th, 18th century, from one manuscript being written in Iran in Persian, 10 were being produced in India. So people use this concept like Bahar to recenter Persian poetry. But at the same time, there's an utter disdain for these poets because they're just meant to be these imitative poets. So you have Yahya Aryanpour, who famously says these were just false Sadis, false Rumis, false Hafezes. So on the one hand, they're relying on them conceptually, but they've totally pushed aside the aesthetic project or their poetry. So I think if one begins to look at their actual poetry, it might be able to answer your question.
I wonder if you've seen, might actually have been begun how if there are some tazkiras which start doing that in that would change the answer here, because then go to nationalism automatic, and then it looks like the answer might be found more in the larger political trends.
Yeah, that's a very, very perceptive point. I mentioned this also in my dissertation, that the Safavids, while their downfall created destruction and needed the reconstitution of poetic networks, nothing ever disappears entirely. So there were poets who, like Mushtaq, who I didn't focus on, who was the teacher of Azhar and Sabahi, who lived before and after the Afghan invasion. So he had teachers before him who were schooled in various styles prior to the downfall of Esfahan. And actually the coffee house culture of Esfahan at the time, it produced a style that I think in some ways anticipates the Bazgash, and this is Maktab-e-Wuqu, so a kind of realist style that was maybe the urbanization of the poetry of people like Rumi, Hafez, and Saadi. because you didn't have court patronage as much in Safavid times as you did in the Mughals. So people were going to the coffee houses. So if you look at the Tazkiras from this time, or even you look at Iranian literature by Jan Ripka, a lot of these individuals producing poetry were cobblers, blacksmiths, butchers, people who had a day job, but were actually just trying to integrate themselves in the literary culture, which was happening down the street from them in Meydan-e Naqsh Jahan. And this kind of trend of Maktab-e Vuku, I mean, could be seen, I'm not totally sold on it, but it could be seen as one of the precursors, stylistically, to this return movement. Because again, you do have, for destructive as the downfall of Esfahan was, you do have these continuities that exist, particularly around kind of educational, instructional genealogies. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, certainly, it's for the Indian style, I mean, and there's other names to call it, but we'll call it Indian style, just because that's what I rely on as a historiographical category. To do it well was certainly a matter of status. And this is the kind of sad or ironic aspect of this style of poetry, which has been totally marginalized, is that if you wanted to make money in India, and tons of people either came from Iran to try their hand at poetry, or were South Asian themselves, I mean, you had to be a really good poet, you had to be quick on your feet, you had to be witty. And you have stories of these poetry circles, the various patrons would come, and he'd say, okay, teeth and blood, who can come up with a bait on this? And they'd go around, and this was just the intellectual environment of this Indian style in a lot of places in South Asia at the time, and that just didn't exist in Iran. That developed differently. So that question of status is maybe something I'll think about. But certainly, I mean, to be a very good poet, I mean, you had to kind of play this intellectual game. You had to create these really complicated metaphors to one-up someone who's probably vying for the same bag of cash. Yeah, and thank you all for attending, and thank you for those fabulous questions. Those are really across the board excellent questions. Thank you so much.